All right, folks, we're going to get started here. You are in the Urban Food Forest and the Permaculture Revolution session, so thanks for joining us. We are really happy to be here today with Naki Braga. Naki is an agroecologist, urban designer, and founder of Geomancer Permaculture, a for-purpose environmental design and advocacy business that organizes communities towards culture change through watershed restoration, food sovereignty, and social housing. Geomancer provides a crowdfunding platform for the support of permaculture-based initiatives that advocates for improved environmental policies and works with visionary clients to develop functional and engaging social ecologies. We're so excited. Let's give it up for Naki. We will have about 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, so I'll be walking around. Save up those questions. We're excited.
Thank you very much. Trying to keep me honest with the 10 minutes. We're going to run through this, and I'll love discussion, so I'll be around afterwards regardless. I do want to give you just one last chance. I'm mostly going to talk about philosophy here, and not necessarily plants. So if you want to sneak out and go to one of the other great sessions, no harm. Get in here. I do want to thank Oak, not just NKSU, right, for having us, not just for inviting me here, but also providing the title for this talk. You know, they were putting the agenda together for this thing over a month ago, and they were like, "What's the title of your talk?" I had no idea, because usually you just make it up the night before. So they threw this out, and it's great, because usually when I start these talks, we spend a little bit of time defining what permaculture is, but frankly, that's not really that interesting. We can instead talk about revolution, right? So I think that precision in language is very important, and we have to have a common definition. If we're going to be talking about revolution throughout this talk, I want you to really understand what I'm referring to. So revolution, to me, is defined as the masses of people awakening to political consciousness and participating directly in decisions that impact the material conditions of their lives. The first thing we have to come to an agreement on is that under business as usual circumstances, this is not the status quo, right? Revolution is a special thing. Now I say that, and at the same time I would be remiss to not mention that just a little bit over a week ago, we saw an absolutely historic, unprecedented in our lifetimes general strike in Minneapolis. And there is nothing that I will ever say that is going to be more important than that. So I want to uplift that, I want to express solidarity with that, right? And that is the direction that we should be heading in, and hopefully we all understand that actually we are living in revolutionary times already. But I do want to develop this, this argument a little bit further. So this graph here depicts an empire on the verge of collapse. This data is salaries in the United States, which is not really what I'm getting at, but it's close enough to kind of try and make this point. That top line there, we have all the financialized aspects of the economy, insurance, banking, real estate, unfortunately. And then down here, we have the material economy, real goods and services. Farmers are down there, right? And the point that I want to make is that that top line cannot be anything but unproductive, parasitic, speculative, and derived from the exploitation of the real labor of the working class. And this is important to understand because there's a lot of liberals out there who say, well, if we just tax the billionaires, that would solve anything. That won't solve shit, because that value that's represented there is completely notional and abstract. It's not real wealth. This is just a snake eating its own tail. So I don't really care what some CEO says their net worth is. What I care about is who controls the land, who grows the food, who has the housing, who holds the guns. That is what we actually should be focusing on. We cannot allow our strategies and perspectives to be determined by capitalist ideology. That is very, very important. This book here, very interesting. Everything was forever until it was no more, written by a Russian sociologist about the closing days of the Soviet regime before it collapsed. And basically what they're talking about is this idea that everyone kind of knew that the whole system was fake, the economy wasn't real, it was all held together by duct tape, and yet at the same time, it was impossible to imagine a future other than what they were already living in. Impossible, of course, until one day everything changes. I think this is a really important mirror for us to be able to hold up to our own society. I'll talk about it a different way too. This study came out last June, and they are looking at reductions in caloric yields from agriculture worldwide in the face of climate change. And this is taking into account all kinds of adaptations, so switching to different crops, different management practices, all the kind of stuff that we talk about in these conferences. And even with all of that, they are still projecting by 2050 a 46% reduction in caloric yield in the United States. Now, some of the quote-unquote less developed nations in the world are going to see less than that because we have further to fall, right? We have more reliance on industrial supply chains and that kind of stuff. What's really interesting about these kinds of studies, because we see them all the time, right? 2050, this and that is going to happen by 2050. I think people look at these things and they say, well, that's 25 years away. It's really going to suck in 2050. And this is not how it works, right? It's not like the clock strikes midnight, 2049, and all of a sudden we have 46% fewer crops. We are currently living through the process that is culminating in 2050, according to this research. So this just shows some of that same data, but some of our key staple crops: maize, soybeans, wheat, rice. Warm colors are bad, cool colors are good. So upper right-hand corner, just looking at soybeans in the Midwest, American Midwest, 50% reduction. So this is what Geomancer, my organization, means when we say that revolution is ecologically inevitable. So how do we deal with that? How do we adapt to that? There's no way that I can with any credibility tell you this crop is going to work. This is how we're going to actually get through this. Some of the projections we're looking at for climate change are calling for an entire changeover of our landscape, our native plant ecology, thousands of years, potentially just gone. We have to make it back up from scratch. Or not from scratch, we can do it together, right? So I'm not going to talk about the crops that we need, I'm talking about the social infrastructure that is going to allow us to adapt in real time, dynamically, together, collaboratively to these challenges as they happen. That is the only credible proposal that I can bring to you. And I know we're in an agriculture conference, but I have to say that housing is really what I care about, right? And this comes back to access to the land. We're always talking about access to the land. How do farmers get access to the land? One of the core contradictions in our society right now, and philosophically we look for those contradictions because that is where we can apply a little bit of pressure and intervention and potentially see some kind of effect. One of the core contradictions in our society, due to the financialization of housing, is between the use value of a dwelling and its exchange value as a commodity. So housing is where we could actually have the biggest effect. Unfortunately, and this is not news to any of you, housing is difficult. Buying land is difficult. It is by no means the lowest branch on the tree, right? So we gotta figure something else out. What's a lower branch on the tree that we can get to try and curate and defend the revolutionary processes, the people taking decisions about their daily lives that are already underway and that are already inevitable? Planting trees is a pretty decent one. You can get trees for a couple bucks, right? And get people together. And then maybe someone who's never had an opportunity to make a material difference in the conditions of their lives, planting that tree, that pollinator garden, whatever it is, this is about the nature of our psychology. It's going to spark something that all of a sudden you start asking, well, what else can I change? Because that median in my neighborhood that's just been mowed forever and nobody was ever doing anything with it, now it's a beautiful pollinator garden, and I did that. So what else can I change? Because in the material world, you can lay hands on it and really do something. But this is still a question, even to do this, just this little stuff, you gotta find the land, right? It comes back to access to land. So let's talk about that. I work out of Lexington, Kentucky. This is a map of our city. The light green is municipal parks owned by the city. And in Lexington, we cannot work with the Parks Department. They're useless. Now the darker green, these are city greenways. They're owned by a different division of government entirely. These are floodplains, they are creeks and detention basins, and various vacant lots, and actually there's a lot more than what's on this map. We've been working to identify potentially over 100 acres or more in Lexington that's buried in development documents that should be municipal floodplains. And that's a very exciting development just in the last couple of weeks. But we identify these, we say that perhaps this is the lowest barrier to entry because no one's doing anything with them. They cannot be built on, right, as floodplains. So how do we get access to them? This is one in my neighborhood. This is the Kilrush Drive Greenway, 3 acres. Was single-family homes and a couple duplexes built in the 60s, and then 25 years ago or so, FEMA came in and knocked them all down because they built them in a floodplain and all the basements were flooding. So the city took it over, and they've been doing nothing but paying mowing contractors to take care of it, quote unquote, just mow it down, right? Ecological desert. And in this picture, you might be able to tell, you can't even see the creek. Wolf Run Creek runs back there, but it's just choked out with all kinds of invasives and stuff like this. Now we do have some neighbors who've been doing annual garden beds right there, right? So we want to preserve that. We want to build on the fact that people have kind of already taken it on themselves to do these illicit gardens. And what else can we do? I want to say, when we talk about a food forest, because that's the proposal, right? What is a food forest? And because it's a pretty silly term if you really get into it. And I want to be clear that what we're actually talking about is trying to get a little closer to the agroecological principles, the patterns, the processes, the practices of indigenous land management, for lack of a better term. And I'm not saying that out of some pathetic white guilt. I'm saying that because it's true. What we think of as the native flora of Kentucky is an intentionally selected for and cared for polyculture over thousands of years, a co-evolution between the people on the landscape and what native plant ecologists think was the perfect state of nature whenever Daniel Boone finally showed up, right? So here's our plant. I don't do very much with graphics. I do just enough to get the city to say, okay, it's a real thing. And that's because the design happens at a different granularity than this. And the map is not the territory, and you have to actually be on the land and working with it before you can really, with any confidence, say a tree should definitely go there, right? So we have to spend time on it. But we came up with this idea of what if we converted that entire 3-acre floodplain to the largest community food forest in Kentucky? And bit by bit, we started doing that. We came in, just 1/10 of an acre at first, started cutting out all the honeysuckle, and at this point, we're just doing this under water quality grants through the city. So the city's like, oh yeah, you're fixing the riparian buffer. You're gonna take out invasives and you're gonna put in native trees, right? I don't have to explain permaculture, I don't have to explain food forests, I'm just doing what's already there in terms of what our culture understands. This was fun. I see Bethany back there. Bethany was there for the bad old days. It was just a chainsaw and a bunch of honeysuckle and a vision that maybe nobody else could understand. So it just so happens that all of the native trees that we put back on this riparian floodplain are fruit trees, nut-bearing species, cane fruits. But they're all native, right? We just sneak them on in. And here's the city coming to check it out. And I love this photo. I always want to point out this dead hedge that we have. You see this long line, that's all the honeysuckle brush that we took out of there. And instead of hauling it out, right, we keep that nutrient cycle on site. We built a microclimate. I could go on and on about all the great features of this thing that we processed down. But the most important piece is that it serves as a mechanical barrier against the idiot contractors that would otherwise just be mowing down all these trees. I want to emphasize that what we're talking about here is taking territory and defending it. That is the framework that we should be looking at. So we end up, here's Alejandro, one of our high school interns in the summer of 2024, and we're starting to move up into the floodplain. You can see we've transplanted a service berry there from another park that was going to get some construction in there, so the city let us take that out and save it. And then later that same year, Here's Pablo, one of our neighbors. He's digging these massive rocks out of this hole just to plant one tree, because this is compacted fill, right? There have been a bunch of houses here, so this soil is really, really rough, y'all. And we're using all kinds of practices to try and heal that. That is really the biggest thing that we're doing. But just to say, we now have hundreds of fruit trees on site. We finally turned a corner just really in the last year where someone other than myself can come out there and be like, I get it. Wow, I get it. And that's because it starts looking like this. This is in June of last year. And you do have to go through a few seasons of people just being like, what the hell are you doing down there? It looks like a mess. And then all of a sudden it turns into a Disney cartoon. And the birds and the bees are there, right? These are all perennial native plants. We can talk about the medicinal value. We can talk about what they're doing as far as living mulch and so forth. But like I said, I'm not going to talk too much about plants today. I will mention a few things. We had a great farmer field day with Organic Association of Kentucky, where we went into a little bit of botanical detail on this stuff. Like I said, it's 3 acres. I think the event was like 3 hours long. And by the end of it, we hadn't even made it halfway up the greenway. There's an incredible density of stuff out there. But we've been very intentional in choosing plants that are, of course, going to be resilient to that site, are going to be adaptive to those soils, and that are going to be prolific in their seed production and their potential for vegetative propagation. Because we are creating this genetic bank that hopefully in the future, no one else has to spend money on these plants because we got all the seeds you'll ever need to build the foundation of another food forest, and another food forest, and another food forest. Some of these plants are not easy to find in the horticultural trade. So we have to look at a lot of things like wetland restoration or the natural resource management industry. And this happens to be the Horticulture Club at University of Kentucky. And because they are not a profit-driven kind of operation, they're a teaching operation, they can afford to grow some of these plants that commercially would not be viable. So it's really important to identify where can you get some of these things. And these native plant operations spring up and go out of business all the time. So when you get them, you gotta get them. And then once you have that plant stock, that seed stock, whatever, you gotta make sure that people continue to have access to it. Another trick we use is State Division of Forestry, Missouri Department of Conservation. I've also gotten some stuff from North Carolina, where basically you pay pennies on the dollar for trees that they're using in reforestation efforts, mineland reclamation, all that kind of thing. But hey, you got oaks, persimmons, pawpaws, service berries, aronia, you got all kinds of things that if you are willing to deal with a tiny little twig that whoever your client is going to be like, that's not a tree. You're like, just be patient, hold on. But the price is right for this kind of plant material. And then you have a farm. So we now have a farm, and we are farming it like a farm, but it's not like a farm because it's all perennials, right? And actually the main product that we have, other than the restored soil microbiology, little by little, is the social infrastructure. That is the biggest thing, is that we now have a space that we've identified that people can come together, collaborate, really physically, materially. This is not conceptual. This is the kind of thing where we're going to mess up, someone's going to get injured, someone's going to get pissed off. Along the way, we have all the opportunity to look each other in the eye and build trust and say, oh yeah, we're doing this together, over and over and over, reaffirming that. Again, that is the crop that we are actually producing. And we do lots of educational events and all that kind of thing. Talk a little bit about some of the plants. Anybody recognize this one? Beautiful. Spring ephemeral. So very underutilized or under-recognized kind of food source. This is a wild hyacinth, Chamaesyas ovoides, same genus as a calamus root in the western United States, which is well known as an indigenous food crop. So this whole thing is edible, delicious tubers. My favorite spring wildflower, Virginia bluebells. Whole thing is edible, right? Kind of like, looks like spinach, so it just suggests itself to you. And I get weird looks. I mean, people freak out when I say, "You're going to eat these spring ephemerals?" If you're in ecological restoration or whatever you want to call it, people are obsessed with spring ephemerals and saving them and making sure no one ever goes and touches them. And people are bad, right? But we go back to that argument that these things, their natural history involves intentional cultivation. we should actually be thinking about our role in not just preserving them, but propagating them, getting them out in the landscape. And these are things that will seed themselves out and don't have to be rare. This doesn't have to be like some special thing that you only find in a couple little corners and you shouldn't tell anybody where that floodplain is. These can be everywhere. We also do some medicinals. This is bloodroot sanguinaria, right? By no means a beginner herb, but nevertheless incredibly important that we recognize these niches and create space for them, even if it's not necessarily marketed. Even if we don't have any expectation of the outcome. Ginseng seeds. Is it insane to be planting ginseng in soils that aren't really for ginseng in an urban area? I mean, maybe, but why not? Right? We're putting things back, again, without expectation of what's going to happen. But this medicine isn't just medicine for us, it's medicine for the soil, it's medicine for the land. It's an energetic transfer of care, right, and reciprocity that we are saying, look man, this land, I understand, has been really mistreated for a lot of time, and we're going to reverse that flow. Rather than extracting from it, we're going to try to put back. We also do research. So this is one of our techs, Chelsea. She's hanging out with, what do they call it? The Perennial Atlas Project from the Land Institute out in Kansas. You guys are pretty well educated on perennials and annuals, but basically you have on the left there annual wheat and then perennial wheatgrass, right? The perennial does not finish its life cycle at the end of the year, so it gets to keep putting its roots down. And when we think about that earlier map I showed of the climate impacts and how things are going to get more difficult, it's pretty easy to think, okay, which one of these is going to be more resilient, right? Pretty much the entire basis of our food system, all the annual crops that we think of as domesticated, well, just the common things that we eat, all of them, they were domesticated and cultivated under conditions of climatic stability that we can no longer take for granted. So we have to adapt. Here's Chelsea with one of those species, Silphium, again, native plants, beautiful, great pollinator support, but potentially, according to this research, and we're finding out, we're getting into our third year of it now, potentially a seed oil crop that could supplement something like sunflowers. All right, let's get into some of the fruits, because, food forest, everybody thinks fruit trees. This is Aronia melanocarpa, black aronia, one of the highest concentrations of antioxidants that we know of, and it doesn't matter if it's in a floodplain. It grows with what we call wet feet, and it'll even fruit in inundated soils. Really, really cool.
Do you want to say that again? Sometimes it's hard to hear, because I've never heard of these.
Yeah, absolutely. So the botanical name is Aronia melanocarpa. So melana, like melanin, carpa, like fruit. So it is the dark fruited Aronia. There's an Aronia arbustifolia that people use in landscapes design a lot. And you can eat that too, but it has red berries. So this one is black Aronia. It has a common name, chokeberry. Not as marketable when you call it chokeberry, right? But this is true of a lot of wild foods. So if you think about the blueberry that you buy at the grocery store, it's big and juicy, right? It's full of water. Think about the wild blueberry that you eat, that sucker is potent, right? The nutrient content is just, it doesn't compare. So this is one of those things that's got some pucker factor in it. But if you throw a few of these in a smoothie or something like that, I mean, perfect. And once you get a taste for it, can't beat it either. Here's something that you don't have to convince anyone to eat. These are service berries. Might be my favorite fruit in the whole world. And people get angry, oh, don't plant fruit trees, it's gonna make a mess. You don't have to worry about this because the birds are gonna get it. You're gonna be fighting the birds. Or you're gonna be helping the birds. You can live together with the birds. Plant enough service berries that everybody gets service berries. That's the whole point, right? If the birds are getting it all, that just means I need to plant more service berries. These things don't really have a shelf life. So they're not going to be marketable in a lot of conventional senses, but they're perfect for something like a U-pip, a seasonal kind of deal. And oh my goodness, I mean, it's so sweet, little hint of vanilla, better than blueberries, truly. How about this one? Yeah, Maypop, passion flower, passion vine, right? Passiflora incarnata, incredible. It's got these juicy kind of seed sacs, almost like a pomegranate. It has like a citrus deal. It's an aggressive grower, actually. So it's another one that we can kind of just let loose and not worry too much about. And what I want to say about all these is that these little fruits, these things that people don't necessarily know about, is how we end up feeling like maybe we can make a credible case that a food system like this could meaningfully contribute to your micronutrients, right? If somebody approaches me and they have like a single family home, they're like, what can I really do here? Can I grow all my calories for the year? I'm like, I mean, if you grow nothing but popcorn and sweet potatoes, maybe. But with some berry bushes and that kind of thing, we can start talking about your vitamins and really kind of actually making a dent with that. But we do want to talk about the macros as well. We want to talk about calories. And that's where a lot of our root crops come in. Here is sunchokes, the tuberous sunflower, Helianthus tuberosus, right? Aggressive grower. Another one that maybe you don't want in your home garden, but in a floodplain, in a food forest, something like that. Perfect. Why not? These have starchy tubers. You got to do some preparation for them, but it ain't nothing to go out in the middle of winter, stick a shovel in the middle of that thing, pull out some stuff, and then by next year, that bald spot is gone. So the infinite sunchoke trick. Here's another one. This is Apios americana, the American groundnut. This is a nitrogen-fixing legume. We are interplanting this with the sunchokes to see if maybe they will cage match to the death together and just be fine. Then we have some native mints in there too. If it works out, we'll call it the Three Brothers, perennial polyculture, right? Cool if it works. We'll find out this year. These have been in the ground for a few years now. And then finally, hazelnuts, because we have to talk about proteins and lipids and that kind of stuff, and especially with the loss of the chestnuts from our landscape, you know, where is this going to come from? Hazelnuts are incredible. This is one of those plants that we know from its natural history, from its range, from the pollen record, that it's spread through the landscape in a way that would have been impossible unless people were intentionally moving it from place to place. And this is one that you can easily vegetatively propagate. It grows in floodplains. Fantastic. A couple years to production, and actually these plants are immortal. As far as I know, as long as you don't kill the root crown, you can chop it down as many times as you want. It'll come right back, another couple of years, and you're back into production. So you can revitalize this over and over again. I really don't think you can make a credible case about any of this without hazelnuts. And then this little guy, I need to update this photo because this tree is now taller than I am. But this is a peach tree, Prunus persica. And so what's the deal with the peach tree, right? Because it's that's Eurasian. It's definitely not native to North America. But the deal is, it came to North America with the Spanish invaders, showed up in Tampa Bay, say 1590 or something like that. And then it went up the native trade networks. It stayed ahead of the smallpox enough that it made it to the interior of the continent. And then all of a sudden, by the time Daniel Boone shows up in Kentucky, native people have been cultivating peaches, selecting their own genetics for hundreds of years. So this is part of that lineage. This is called a Cherokee peach. We grew 3 of them from seed, and we have them there. And I'm not even that big of a fan of peaches, to be honest, but it allows us to really talk about that there's an anthropological aspect to whether a plant is native or not. And we get into a lot of fights with native plant chauvinists who think, again, that people have nothing to do with the natural world, they can only mess it up, and so we gotta keep them out. And we're trying to make the exact opposite argument. So we start sprinkling in things like this so that we can tell people about this history. All right, here's what you actually came for, is to figure out how do we get money to do any of this. I say strategy on here. I'm not going to pretend that it was like super well thought out. This is kind of what we stumbled into and what we found works along the way. Might be different for you. But generally speaking, it has happened sequentially like this. And I put a question mark on agroforestry and ag conservation because we are still fighting a political battle to get the city of Lexington to register this greenway as a farm so that we can treat it like a farm and say that the city is running a farm intentionally and go through some of the programs that we're going to talk about. So just keep that in mind. And here's all the money that we've ever used at Kilrush. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but it basically maps to that same list that you just saw. We started with very little money for water quality projects. Then we got more money from water quality projects because they saw that we were actually doing something. Then there was a little bit of a zeitgeist around urban forestry and stuff. The American Rescue Plan Act gave a lot of money to different cities. And then there was money for trees. But there was no money for the herbaceous understory, right? So we got to navigate that. But we used the urban forestry funding. And then more recently, we have started to play into some of the agriculture conservation funding. The stuff that you guys, as Oak, probably know a little bit more about. And then ultimately the goal, as I mentioned here, long-term contract with property owners. We want the city to say, oh yeah, we should be doing this on purpose and we should be paying you to do it. Or at least training our staff to do it so we can scale it, right? So we have gotten a good chunk of money, $25,000 from Lexington City Council. We're drawing that down right now, but we don't have actual sustainable committed funding for the future. That is going to be the next threshold of this project. So before making this slide, I had never actually really totaled it all up. And when I got to the end, I was like, holy shit, $80,000 is amazing. But over 6 years, right? It's not actually amazing at all. And I don't want to claim that anyone is going to make money doing this. We can talk about making money doing this. You know, the system that we're using, I think probably tops out at like 5-7 acres in terms of what a single farm should be able to manage. And the marketability of it would be measured in tens of thousands of dollars rather than hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it is something that you can do. Now, this average is really, it's skewed by the fact that the first couple of years we had very, very little money. But you can kind of think about, okay, in the $13,000 range, and again, I'm barely keeping the lights on, right? And we're paying interns $15 an hour, $20 an hour once they really get it. And so ballpark, for you to figure out, is this something that you can do? It's tough. But we are going to go through some of these programs and specific things that I think you can go after. One thing I'm not going to talk about is long-term contract with property owners because it's so completely subjective. And it's going to be very unique to your particular situation. So if you want to get into detail with that, we can, on side conversation. But otherwise, I'm going to go backwards here. I'm going to start with agroforestry, ag conservation type stuff because I assume that you guys are more familiar with that. And then by the time we get to the water quality stuff, that's going to be a little more technical and maybe a little bit of a new topic for you. So, ag conservation funding, you all know about NRCS, right? And if you can register a piece of property with the Farm Service Agency as a farm, that opens up eligibility to a number of different programs. Now, in Kentucky, I really want to highlight the CAPE program, County Agricultural Investment Program. You don't have to mess with the federal government at all. That is a county-level program from the tobacco settlement money. That is a reimbursement program, but that is the first one that anybody should be looking for. I really, really recommend you check that one out. Past that, you start getting into things like EQIP and CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program, through NRCS. Again, this is going to be reimbursement-based. It's going to be based around conservation management practices that they have. So, for instance, things like installing windbreaks on your farm, installing riparian forest buffers to help water quality and stop soil erosion, installing pollinator plots to increase crop production and support, right? And these are all things that you can come up with a little Venn diagram that says, well, that can be a food forest, or that can at least be one aspect of it, and the federal government will help you with that. We also have just an increasing awareness of urban food forests in general. Now, I want to be clear, this is the Forest Service, which is still a division of USDA, but it's different from NRCS. NRCS does not recognize food forests. NRCS has relatively discreetly defined management practices that they will actually say, yeah, that counts. And here in Kentucky, forest farming is one that they do not recognize. They recognize it in other states, but isn't that absurd with like all the Appalachian culture and heritage of forest farming here in this state that they don't do that? So that's one of the policy and advocacy pieces that we're involved in, along with a number of other partners, and hopefully we will see that turned on in the year to come. But when it comes to the Forest Service, because there's this urban forestry thing and all of the public health benefits as well as the environmental quality benefits of urban forestry, there is it's a little more adjacent to the social issue. So urban food forests, people are starting to understand what that means. And again, just like I said, food forests are kind of a weird term. Understand that when you're working with USDA, agroforestry comes with a capital A. It is a narrowly defined thing. So we understand as farmers that agroforestry is like this. It's many, many things. But as far as USDA is concerned, it's like a couple little things. So you have to thread that needle, and you have to be able to describe whatever you're doing in terms that they will understand or that the program will support, right? That's like applying for any grant. No big deal. But, like I said, awareness is growing, and there are more and more places, especially urban areas, that are connecting this thing between the floodplains that we can't develop on, therefore there is less development pressure like we're going to face in any other urban farm, right? As that land value goes up, as the neighborhood gentrifies and all that stuff, eventually something bad might happen. In these floodplains, we can maybe say, yeah, we expect actually that legally no one is supposed to build here, they're already public land, so why can't we double duty, stack our functions, as we say in permaculture, and grow food there? This just came out a couple months ago, and documents like this help you speak the language of your city's planning department. So your city government might not really care about growing food on public land, but they might care about water quality, they do care about public health, they do care about urban design and good urban design and potentially some bullshit like attracting tourism. And if you can, again, thread that needle and explain what you're doing in these terms, that is part of the magic. All right, so this is Savannah Institute. They're one of the bigger outfits in the capital A agroforestry space, right? They're mostly based in the Midwest, so like Illinois, Wisconsin. There's a lot of stuff going on with University of Missouri, for instance. Their model is not really something I'm so interested in. It's more row crops, alley cropping, big agronomic production of things like hazelnuts and elderberries on huge acreage. So not necessarily the most relevant thing for us here in Kentucky, but nevertheless we can learn from what they're doing, right? And adapt the work that they are doing, the research that they are doing. On the other side of us, we have Appalachian Sustainable Development, ASD. They're based out of Virginia. They are very focused in forest botanicals, things like ginseng, ramps and so forth, things that are already recognized as crops by the USDA. And they got a bunch of money too. So on that side of the fence, we're talking about Virginia Tech, University of Pennsylvania Extension. Those are the ones that are kind of fueling a lot of this stuff. So I think if you take a cup of Savannah Institute and a cup of Appalachian Sustainable Development and stir them up together, you start to get something that feels a little bit more like Kentucky. And if you think about, okay, University of Missouri is doing this amazing stuff in the West, and Virginia Tech is doing this amazing stuff in the East, realize that we got, well, nature abhors a vacuum, right? So somebody in Kentucky has got to step up. Maybe it's KSU, who knows? But there is a need for endogenous agroforestry development in this state. This is the Catalyzing Agroforestry Grant Program put together by what was the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. They are no longer the Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. They are just the Forest Farmer Coalition. But this is money through Virginia Tech as well. This is pretty low-hanging fruit. Anybody should be able to apply for this if you've got some land. This is still reimbursement-based. It's per acre. It's just a few $1,000s. It's not a lot, but very easy to apply for. Pretty broad in terms of what they'll let you do. You don't have to just be doing these agronomic production species. You can be a little more promiscuous. All right, so now moving into the forestry, urban forestry side of things. As I said, they call it urban and community forestry now. So that community piece, the social benefit piece, is where we kind of get our foot in the door and say, oh, it's not just tree canopy, it's also reduction in particulate matter, it's also reduction in biomarkers of inflammation due to biodiversity, because we are now seeing that that correlates in the latest research. It's amazing. So this program is out of Kentucky Division of Forestry, and you can get money to plant trees. Simple as that. I'm going to start speeding up a little bit because we're almost out of time, but Kentucky Association of Conservation Districts, every county in Kentucky, I think, should have at least one conservation district. Reach out to them. They're not all useful, they don't all have funding, they're not all well managed, but this is basic due diligence. Start with your conservation district. They're going to help you get set up with NRCS. They're going to help you find maybe some of their own sources of funding. We've had an amazing partnership the last couple of years with the Fayette County Conservation District. So absolutely use this resource. All right, now we get into the water quality stuff, and you see that the text gets really small, right? This is all technical stuff. This is legal stuff. You don't have to understand all of it, but you do have to play this game. And it's actually kind of nice, because if you're used to writing grants where you have to do this pretty narrative about how great everything you're doing is, you don't have to do this with that. You just be objective and say, I am implementing this BMP, this best management practice that you have already determined is a thing. And they'll be like, oh, great, that's it. You don't have to convince us, it's just technically what this program is there to fund. So this is here, this consent decree thing. EPA sues cities when they mess up, or at least it used to. For violations of the Clean Water Act. And in the city of Lexington, we ended up with a stormwater quality projects incentive grant program as a result of that. Now everybody's bills went up to pay for this, but some of this money is being put back into projects like the food forest, projects like riparian forest buffers. And so if you know how to speak this language, you can get a piece of that money. And we've actually had a lot of success advocating for policy changes in this case, where they used to only award grants on the basis of reduction in impervious surface areas. So do you tear out your parking lot and put in impervious pavers or something? We said, well, okay, you have a calculation to value a grant application based on the square footage of reduction in impervious surface area. What if you did the same thing, but valued establishment of new native tree canopy instead? They were like, yeah, we could do that. We got the square footage calculation, and we were able to get it passed. So now there is dedicated funding from a legally mandated utility fee that is for tree establishment. And I think that might be the only example of that in the country. Just to throw out Louisville, you know, they have some of this stuff too. Municipal sewer district, money to plant trees because trees help with water quality. So if you can talk the water quality language, it's a different field from agriculture, but again, there's a Venn diagram. You can get some of this money. This super hunky guy here is Dr. Brian Storrs. He works for the state government here in Frankfurt. He is the basin coordinator for the Licking River watershed. He brought a bunch of his associates and colleagues from all over Kentucky to the food forest to look at this thing, because they have problems, especially with small municipalities that have no access to funding, convincing people to implement some of these water quality incentives. And so a light bulb went off in their head and they said, well, what if we call it a food forest? All of a sudden you're getting some buy-in, and people might be more willing to do these things. So we can actually find allies like this who are just trying to do their job and do the water quality thing. And you say, if you let me do it as an ag project, you're going to get a lot further. All right, now we're running with the big dogs. Federal 319H grants. This is not something that you're going to come up with a plan in the basement with your buddy, right? This is, you're at the adult table now. You've got to have partners with city government to be eligible for this grant. You have to have a watershed management plan that's been written by an engineering firm, right? So it's going to be out of reach for some municipalities, but there are the boxes you can check to gain eligibility. Why is this so important? This is so important because this is one of the few grants that I have found that you can actually use to buy land. It's the first thing I look for in any grant is, can you use this to buy land? And it says no, I move on to the next one. This one you can use. It's got to be water quality focused, right? You got to frame it in that way. I'm going to buy this farm. You don't have to tell them you're buying a farm. Tell them you're buying a floodplain to, reforest it. Oops, then it turned into a farm. I just learned about this one. This is a mouthful. I'm not even going to say that, but that's the name of the program. This is NRCS. This has been funded by the federal government through at least 2030. So it's not going to disappear, at least not too long from now. And this is, again, huge pots of money. This is stuff for like building bridges, removing dams. I think NYC is using this right now to run irrigation to a bunch of vacant lots in the city and turn them into farms. So you can really use this for some interesting things. And here's the punchline. It's a national program. The woman who runs it is based out of the Lexington NRCS office. You can go sit down with her and have a conversation and say, what do we need to do? So I've taken this to the Lexington Division of Engineering, and we're talking about it and seeing, yeah, this is actually a legitimate pile of money. They will do a lot of the documentation and engineering work, and we might be able to get bridges built, connect neighborhoods that haven't been connected before, on and on. And then finally, the last piece was the self-funding, right? I have to say, that's ultimately the strategy that we're pursuing is some independence, because we have to maintain our political independence. It means we have to, at some point, rely on ourselves for funding. So we do crowdfunding, we have a Patreon account, and this is the kind of thing, the cool thing about this is that there is no upper limit. There's really no reason why we couldn't be pulling in $20, $40, $60, $80,000 a month if we can make this case, and especially show it to people outside of Kentucky and say, hey, California, give me some money over here. Look what we can do in Kentucky with this. It's going to go a lot further, right? So please tell this story. I'm not really good at asking for money, but I can shamelessly, unapologetically ask you to share our Patreon and other social media and whatever with anyone you think might be interested in this. And so that is the end of the talk. That's where you can find us. And I would love to take any questions. Thank you.
Out there?
Got one up front. Oh.
I was curious about what your experience is working with other organizations. Around here, I'm from Cincinnati, and I just started volunteering with the Permaculture project, doing kind of sunlight in the works. So I was curious if you met with other organizations in different cities doing this kind of work, and what your experience was with that.
Yeah, let's see. This works great. Constantly partnering with everyone, right? So we have, just in this slide, we have the city government that runs a summer youth job training program that gets us some of these high schoolers to work on not just this project, but several of our projects. Fayette County Public Schools, that we go and do environmental education and get their kids out, right? Some of these kids are too young to necessarily be digging holes, but we are still showing them what's going on in their own neighborhood. And these kids are this tall, and so are the trees. So by the time those trees are bearing fruit, we want these kids to have been to the food forest constantly. We walk down, it's amazing when you take 60 kids down from the elementary school, and we're close enough that we can just walk. And the first thing I ask is, who here knows how to get here from their house, right? And then later we see them starting to bring their parents. So that's one thing. Now other organizations, it's a little messier. Lexington is what we call a small pond. And there's a lot of people who have a lot of ego investment in being like the tree guy. And so, I don't want to be the tree guy. I want to be the social housing, person. So it doesn't, we don't get involved in that kind of stuff, but we still have to navigate it. It's really helpful to have training in ecology, because then you can think about everything as an ecosystem, and you can look at each individual organization and say, what role is this thing playing in the ecosystem? Sometimes it's not helpful. And sometimes the biggest indication of that is that they're getting a lot of support. Why is money supporting this thing? Oh, it's because it's greenwashing this other bullshit, right? I don't actually necessarily want to be involved with that. But talking to everybody, but also being really clear about what your own principles are philosophically so that you don't compromise on them, right? We have a very focused mission, and we understand that it is not the same as everybody else. One of the biggest things is that we are not a nonprofit. We run a book club where we kind of talk about a lot of these issues. One of the last things that we've read is an anthology called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which is a series of essays about just the nonprofit industrial complex and the challenges of it. One of a really cool project that we're about to start up with AVOL Kentucky, which is a AIDS volunteers, kind of public health advocacy nonprofit. They're incredible. They've been around since the 80s, and yet nevertheless, they are part of that nonprofit industrial complex. And so we have to be clear in our own organization, like, okay, on the basis of what principles are we working with this group, right? And so that we can communicate that with integrity to them and also internally. So it's not like sorry, it's not one answer, right? It's very dynamic. I'm gonna say, think ecologically for sure. That's gonna help you be clear about what you're doing.
Hey, Nagi, one of the best presentations I've seen at Oak. Thank you.
Yo, thank you.
I've got 2 questions. Do you teach any permaculture-oriented workshops or PDCs? And then also, are there open field days where people can just come volunteer on the farm?
Yeah, 100%. So we have a standing General Assembly on the 2nd Saturday of every month. And that is basically, it's disguised as a volunteer day, but the idea is that at some point there's gonna be like 40 people out there, and I'm gonna be like, look, I don't have enough tools for this, so instead of working, let's talk to each other about the conditions of our lives and what else we can imagine. And we do some of this stuff too. We got a meeting tomorrow because there's snow everywhere and stuff. So rather than being out there and being cold and not really getting that much work done, it's gonna be more productive for us to meet and talk about consolidation of membership in the organization, clarify our political principles, and move forward. As far as the education piece, absolutely. Permaculture is a pyramid scheme, and the only way to make money in permaculture is by teaching other people permaculture. So I'm clear about that. It would be sweet, man. A permaculture design certificate, like a little 2-week thing that people pay like $1,200 for. Are you kidding? If I ran like 2 of those a year, I'd be done. I wouldn't have to do anything else. That'd be enough income to support me. So absolutely, we're trying to build towards that, but we're also like trying to have something actually of value to show people. And with something like the food forest, it's only now that we have trees that are old enough, we have things that are actually producing, that I feel like, okay, with some credibility, I could claim to, show people this. And we also have other projects that have been around for long enough that we can say, here's what this looks like when you really don't maintain it for 5 years, and it does actually work. So yes, we are building towards that. I just mentioned our upcoming partnership with the AVOL organization. We are going to, we're going to launch that in a public event on February 10th. And part of the plan is we're going to be working on their campus and turning that into a food forest and medicinal garden. And we'll do like a 4-month, basically ecological design training for their volunteer base and the general public. And we're still working to design exactly what that's going to be. Frank, 4-month, probably like 1 event per month. So we're not going to get super deep on anything. But yes, building that capacity is a huge piece. And certainly I only have 2 hands. So the whole point of this is to train more people to do more stuff. This gets back to the competitiveness thing, that, there can only be one permaculture guy. It's like, I don't want to do this the rest of my life. This is so basic. This is so basic. We're just getting started. We're just creating the conditions where these conversations can even take place. So the more people that I train to do what I'm doing, the less I have to do, and the more I can move on to what I'm actually here to do, right? Which is more and more ambitious and complex kind of projects that we don't even have the horizon for right now, because we need to establish the base for it first. So yes, absolutely, education, super important. Happy to come to anyone's county, town, home, and help you with that aspect if you got something like that going in your community.
Okay, I probably need to have a conversation with you because I'm gonna narrow it down to 2 questions. My name's Alethea, and I'm with the Grow Leafy. And 2 questions. First one's about myself. You're talking about natives, and in my backyard, so I love all of this. I farm in my backyard. I'm just very particular about the invasive plants that I know that are wonderful. So, any suggestions on backyard gardeners that, that can integrate that without it taking over? Because I also work full-time. My other thing is, so I work full-time because I'm a social worker and a counselor, but also, in my business, I educate across my community in kids and schools and summer camps about growing their own foods. And so, without becoming too overwhelming, because it's just me, and now I have a smaller team, what is something simple that I can do to continue spreading this message without it being overwhelming, because there's so much that I could do. So any tips you have would be great.
Yeah. So the backyard design thing is going to be tough to like comprehensively answer, right? But if I'm understanding correctly, you're interested in integrating some of these perennials that can kind of like, I'm just going to leave them alone, but at the same time, like, could they play nice with what you're already doing, right? And so that comes down to each individual plant as an individual, and understanding its life cycle, and what kind of spatial relations it has with other plants. So the more access you can get, like make time to go somewhere that is a relatively quote-unquote undisturbed forest system, right? Because then you can see like, oh, okay, this is what a pawpaw looks like when it's grown right next to a mulberry, and neither one of them are angry about it, with a spice bush underneath and that kind of thing. It's just gonna help you understand what's up. As far as keeping like weed competition down and things, I really like, honestly, when I hear an old white lady say, don't plant that in your garden, it'll take over. It's like, oh, that's the plant I want. So violets and strawberries, both native, both great. Weeding strawberries that are coming into your garden bed is gonna be a hell of a lot easier than weeding out Bermuda grass. So I know which one I'm gonna pick. So when we talk about ground cover polyculture design in particular, there are just different kinds of growth strategies that plants employ. And if you have a diversity of them, like, oh, this one kind of clumps up, this one puts out little runners, right? This one spreads underground. And if I can fill all that up and they fight each other, I don't really care who's gonna win. Maybe even, 5 years from now, it's just nothing but strawberries. Oh, well, that's fine. It's still better than a lawn. But that density and diversity of occupying all those niches, not just above ground, but also in the soil, is going to keep, it's going to be a lot harder for an invasive to come in there. And then when you really got to fight dirty, you can do things like planting the sunchokes, the Jerusalem artichoke that's going to be so dense and spread, and just be like, oh, that can go into the neighbor's yard, that's their problem now, right? But you have that barrier. Pawpaws can do that too. A big, thick pawpaw patch, I think, is kind of a decent candidate for, like, if you had something really gnarly, like Japanese knotweed or something on somebody else's property, having some of that density there and building it that way is something I would suggest. So hard to answer. Your second question about like a small tangible thing that you can take with somebody. So I suffered from, I'm a city kid originally, right? And I still am. So I suffered from the green wall syndrome when I was younger. I would go listen to people talk about this is this plant, this is that plant, and I'm like, I don't know what you thought, they're all the same. They all look exactly the same. And then I started learning one by one, right? And just like I know that that's Heather and that's Bethany, now I know that that's pawpaw and that's mulberry. And if I just learn one a year, that's one fewer I gotta know next time, right? And when people start working with me, I don't teach them the good plants, I teach them the weeds. I say, you don't have to know what all this stuff is. I just want you to know this one plant that you can remove, and you never have to ask me again. You can just assume that one is safe for you to remove. We can build off of that. So once you have that relationship, and you know that plant as an individual, it has to be relational, right? It can't be this abstract knowledge. That's the most important thing. So how do you make it relational? Food is a great way to do that. If you can find that strawberry or whatever and have the kid have an opportunity, right? That's going to connect in a way that just telling them about it is not. And I think it's really powerful to, again, go into some of these forest systems, remnant woodlands, whatever you can find. It doesn't have to be totally undisturbed. It just has to have a little bit of the juice there, because like I said, our native ancestors did an incredible job creating an agroecosystem on the landscape scale, and there are still pieces of that surviving everywhere to a greater or lesser extent. And once you can start pointing that out to people, potentially a kid, right, then that becomes really powerful, that they know that just outside in the weeds, in that woods, it's like, oh no, there's food out there, right? We say every forest is actually a food forest to those that inhabit it. It's just a frame of reference kind of thing.
Okay, let's give it up for Naki.